In a bustling courthouse in a small town, the white judge sat at his desk, staring down at a stack of papers that seemed to grow with every passing moment. The courthouse was filled with the constant shuffle of people in and out of the building, each with their own case, their own story, most of them irrelevant to the judge, who had long become used to the daily routine and monotonous flow of court proceedings. He had earned his position with years of experience, and knew how to handle every type of case with the same level of efficiency, as if they were all the same. The judge looked up briefly at the clock. As he adjusted his glasses, the case before him was a traffic violation case involving a woman named Maria, a name that he didn't think twice about. As he scanned over the details briefly, Maria was listed as a black woman, and the judge had already made an assumption based on the information in front of him: her age, the nature of the violation, and the fact that she appeared to be just another person caught in the rush of everyday life, with no greater significance than anyone else who had crossed his courtroom before. He didn't know anything about her background or her profession. He didn't know that Maria was far more than what her file indicated. All he saw was a name and a ticket, and he quickly moved on to the next case. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs of people waiting for their turn, some fidgeting in their seats, others anxiously whispering to their lawyers or family members as they prepared to hear their fates. The judge took no notice of the tension in the air. He was accustomed to it. His eyes flicked over the names as the court clerk called them one by one, until it was Maria's turn to stand in front of him. The woman, who had been quietly sitting among the crowd of people, now stood tall and walked up to the front, her face calm, her posture confident. She looked like someone who had seen hardship and triumph in equal measure, but the judge didn't notice the subtle strength in her gaze or the quiet resolve in her demeanor. He simply saw a woman who was late for her court date and had been caught in a minor traffic violation. His mind was already preparing the usual response, a fine, with no further thought to the reason behind her actions. The judge cleared his throat and gestured for her to speak. Maria opened her mouth to explain her situation, but before she could fully articulate her thoughts, the judge held up his hand, silencing her. He had already decided what was going to happen, and no explanation would change that. In his mind, her story didn't matter. All that mattered was the paperwork in front of him and the routine of keeping the courtroom moving. The words of her explanation hung in the air like an unfinished thought. She mentioned that she had been helping a family affected by a recent storm, but before she could go any further, the judge quickly dismissed her words as irrelevant to the case at hand. He tapped his gavel, signaling the decision, and ordered the fine. Maria stood there in silence for a moment, her eyes never leaving his face, before she nodded slowly and turned to walk back to her seat. The courtroom was silent as she moved, but the judge didn't notice the quiet shift in energy around him. He was already moving on to the next case. In his mind, Maria was just another name on the list, another person who would pay their dues and move on from this small moment in time. She was nothing special in the judge's eyes, just another person in a long line of cases he had seen over the years. Maria walked back to her seat, her mind racing as she tried to gather her thoughts. She had expected some resistance when she came to court that day, but nothing like this. The judge had been quick to dismiss her story, to overlook the real reason she had been late to her hearing. She could feel the weight of his dismissal hanging in the air. As she sat down, the room felt colder somehow, as if the atmosphere had shifted with the judge's swift decision. She glanced around the courtroom, hoping to see a sympathetic face, but there was only the sea of indifferent people, each caught up in their own struggles. No one seemed to care about her story. No one seemed to understand that she was more than just a woman caught in a traffic violation. She was a person who had dedicated her life to helping others, who had put herself in harm's way countless times to provide aid to those who needed it most. Yet here she was being reduced to a minor infraction in the eyes of the law. She shook her head and let out a long breath. It was hard to stay composed in the face of such injustice, but she knew better than to let her emotions take over. She had seen too much in her work to allow a moment like this to shake her. Maria had seen devastation up close. She had been on the front lines of hurricanes, earthquakes, and floods, had stood in the midst of destroyed homes and communities with nothing but the clothes on her back and a determination to help those who had lost everything. She had worked for hours on end, coordinating relief efforts, bringing together volunteers and resources to provide food, shelter, and medical care. She had seen people at their lowest moments and helped them rebuild their lives from the ground up. She had been the one to give hope when there was none left. But here in this courtroom, none of that mattered to the judge. He had seen only what was in front of him: a traffic ticket, a late appearance, and a woman who didn't seem to fit his expectations. Maria felt her stomach twist as she replayed the judge's cold response over and over in her mind, but she couldn't afford to dwell on it. Not now. She had work to do. She had a job to get back to, a mission that was far bigger than this one small moment in a courtroom. She thought of the family she had helped in the past weeks, the children who had lost their homes, the elderly who had no place to go, the people who were still waiting for the aid they so desperately needed. It was them she had been thinking of when she arrived late to her hearing, not the judge or the courtroom or the fine that was now hanging over her head. Her mind returned to the task ahead: how to move forward with her work despite the setback, how to continue helping those in need when the system around her seemed so indifferent to her role. Maria stood up again, her movements slow but deliberate. She was determined not to let this minor injustice define her or her work. She would not let the judge's assumption about her worth take away the fire inside her that had been burning for so long. She turned to face the exit, ready to leave the courtroom and return to her real purpose in life, the one that mattered more than any fine or any ruling from a man who had no idea what it meant to truly serve others. As Maria stepped out of the courtroom, the cool air hit her face, and for a moment she felt a sense of relief. The weight of the judge's judgment seemed to lift with each step she took away from the courthouse. But then the reality of the situation began to settle in her stomach. Churned as she thought about what had just happened, she had expected resistance, but not to be dismissed so easily. Her thoughts were interrupted as she passed a small group of courthouse workers, huddled together, whispering and glancing in her direction. She couldn't hear their words, but she knew they were talking about her. She had felt the eyes of the courtroom on her as she had left the judge's chambers. They had all seen what had happened, and now it was the talk of the building. She quickened her pace, her mind racing with thoughts of what she could do next. She needed to find a way to move on from this, not let it hold her back. She had seen too many disasters in her life to be fazed by a single moment of injustice, but still it stung deeper than she had anticipated. Just then, she heard a voice behind her, a woman's voice calling her name. Maria turned and saw a young woman hurrying toward her. It was one of the clerks from the courthouse. She recognized her from earlier in the day. The woman stopped in front of her and caught her breath before speaking. Maria noticed that her eyes were wide with curiosity and something else, maybe admiration or maybe surprise, but she couldn't tell for sure. The clerk hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "Excuse me, Maria, I didn't mean to disturb you, but I overheard something earlier, and I had to ask," she said, her voice a little uncertain. Maria raised an eyebrow, unsure of what to expect, but nodded for the woman to continue. "I heard you talking to someone about helping a family displaced by the storm," the clerk said slowly, her gaze not leaving Maria's face. "And I just wanted to say that I think what you do is incredible. I mean, it's not every day that you meet someone like you." Maria was taken aback by the woman's words. For a moment, she didn't know how to respond. No one ever spoke to her like this, especially not in a place like this, where people were quick to judge her by her appearance, her status in the community. She had learned long ago to keep her work to herself, to not seek recognition. But here was this woman standing in front of her, admiring what she did. Maria felt a mix of emotions, gratitude and discomfort, all at once. "Thank you," Maria said finally, her voice steady, though there was a flicker of uncertainty behind her words. The clerk smiled and lowered her voice a little more. "You should know, Maria, that I looked up your name after hearing you talk. I know that you've been doing disaster relief work for years. You're one of the top coordinators in the region, aren't you?" she asked, her eyes full of genuine respect. Maria blinked in surprise. She hadn't expected anyone here to know about her background, much less acknowledge it with such sincerity. "Yes," she said, her voice quieting for a moment. "I've been working in disaster relief for quite a while, but it's not something I usually talk about with people in places like this." The clerk nodded like she understood before continuing. "Maria, what you're doing out there, it's more important than anything that's going on in this building. But I need to tell you something." The judge, he didn't know who you were or what you've done. He just saw a name and a ticket. "I think he made a mistake," she said softly. Maria felt a knot in her chest loosen at her words. It wasn't much, But it was something the judge hadn't even known who she was yet. He had still dismissed her with such coldness. Maria sighed heavily for a moment, just wishing that things had gone differently here. Maybe she would have been heard, maybe she would have been understood, but the damage was done. She would have to figure out how to move forward despite it all. Maria stood there for a moment as the clerk's words lingered in the air. She could feel a sense of relief creeping into her chest, but it was quickly overshadowed by a deep frustration that refused to go away. It wasn't about the fine or the ruling, it was about being seen for who she truly was, and for the work she had devoted her life to. No one in this courthouse seemed to understand the weight of what she carried, the lives she had touched and helped rebuild in the aftermath of disasters. It was as if her worth could be defined by a ticket and a court date, no matter the countless hours she had spent on the ground helping communities devastated by the forces of nature. She had spent weeks in shelters guiding volunteers and coordinating resources. She had watched families grieve and rebuild from the ruins of their homes. She had witnessed firsthand the power of hope and the resilience of people who had nothing left except their determination to rise from the ashes. Yet none of that mattered here, not to the judge, not to the people in this courthouse. It was as if the very essence of her purpose had been erased in an instant, and it stung more than she had expected. Maria blinked as she realized the clerk was still standing there watching her, waiting for some kind of response. She knew she should say something to ease the tension in the air, but all she could do was shake her head slowly. No one here seemed to care or understand what it meant to dedicate yourself to others, what it meant to give up so much of yourself to help strangers who had lost everything. But somehow the clerk's presence was comforting. It was as if she was the only person who truly saw Maria for who she was, the only person who could understand the weight of what she had been through and still carried with her every day. Maria finally spoke, her voice low and steady. "Thank you," she said simply. "I appreciate that, but it doesn't change what happened in there. I can't change the judge's decision. It's already been made, and it stings more than I thought it would." She paused for a moment and looked at the ground. The clerk watched her carefully before speaking again. "I know it doesn't change what happened, Maria, but sometimes people just don't know what they don't know," she said. "And I know I didn't understand everything until I looked up your work. But I can see now that you're not just some woman with a ticket. You're doing important work. You're doing things that matter, things that most people will never see. And I think that should be recognized." Maria didn't know how to respond. She wasn't used to praise or attention for her work. She didn't do what she did for the recognition. She did it because it was what needed to be done. But somehow hearing this woman speak to her so openly felt different than anything she had ever experienced here in this place. It felt like for the first time someone truly saw her. She wasn't just another person in the system. She wasn't just another statistic in a list of cases. She was someone who was out there making a difference, even if it wasn't recognized by the people around her. Maria sighed and met the clerk's eyes. "Thank you," she said again, this time with more feeling. "But I still have a job to do. There's so much more work to be done out there, and I can't afford to let this keep me from it. I just have to move forward. I can't let it hold me back." The clerk smiled at her. Then before she could say anything more, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. Maria turned to see a man in a suit walking toward them. It was one of the court officers. His face was unfamiliar, but his eyes locked onto hers in a way that caught her attention. He stopped in front of them and introduced himself in a soft voice. "Maria, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I heard what happened in the courtroom, and I wanted to say that I think you're doing incredible work. I just wanted to make sure you knew that not everyone in this building thinks the same way as the judge," the officer said, his voice filled with genuine respect. Maria stared at him in surprise. He had no idea who she was, just like the others. But somehow his words felt different. He wasn't just saying this to appease her. He was saying it because he truly believed it. Maria stood frozen for a moment, taking in the officer's words, her mind racing. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected any of this. But here it was someone else acknowledging her work, recognizing that her role in the world was more than just a traffic violation, more than just a name on a docket. It felt almost surreal, like a weight she didn't realize she was carrying was finally being lifted just a little bit. But it also left her with a lingering sense of confusion. Why now? Why had these people chosen this moment to offer their support after everything that had just happened? The officer smiled gently, waiting for her to say something, but Maria struggled to find the right words. She was used to handling tough situations, handling emergencies, leading people through some of the worst moments in their lives. But this was different. This wasn't a disaster zone or a shelter filled with survivors. This was a courthouse filled with judgment and bureaucracy, a place where she was treated like nothing more than a statistic. But now here was this officer speaking to her, as though he saw the whole picture, as though he understood her worth. And what she brought to the world, she didn't know how to respond to that, not when she had spent so much of her life fighting to be seen and heard without ever asking for anything in return. "Thank you," Maria said finally, her voice softer than she had intended but sincere. "I appreciate that. But I can't stay here much longer. I need to get back to my work. There's so much happening out there that needs my attention more than this court case." "Ever will?" The officer nodded as if he understood completely. "I get it." He said, "I'm sure your work out there means more than anything this court could offer. But I wanted to make sure you knew that there are people here who see you, who respect what you're doing, and who want to make things right." Maria nodded slowly. She appreciated the sentiment, but the truth was she didn't need anyone here to validate her. She didn't need their approval. What she needed was to get back to the field, to the people who needed her. But for some reason, the officer's words had started to shift something inside of her. For the first time in a long time, she felt a small spark of hope. Maybe not all of the systems in place were completely indifferent. Maybe there was room for change. Maybe she didn't have to fight alone. Maybe the fight wasn't just hers to carry. After all, the clerk stood silently beside them, watching the exchange quietly, as if she too could sense that something had shifted in the air. Maria took a deep breath and straightened up her posture, feeling the weight of her responsibility settling back into place. It had never been about the courthouse or the fine. It had never been about the judgment of people who didn't understand what it meant to be on the ground doing the work, the true work of helping others. What mattered was the people she served, the ones who were lost in the chaos of the world, the ones who had no one else to turn to. And that was where she needed to be, not here, not dwelling on an unjust moment. She had to keep moving forward. She had to keep pushing ahead. No matter what small setbacks came her way, the officer's presence still lingered, and Maria felt an unspoken understanding between them that perhaps he would stand with her if the need ever arose. But it wasn't enough to make her stay in the courthouse. It wasn't enough to make her forget the people waiting for her in the field. Maria turned to the clerk and gave her a small nod of gratitude for her kindness, then turned to the officer and offered him a brief smile before making her way toward the door. As she walked through the hallway toward the exit, she could feel the eyes of the courthouse following her. But this time she didn't care. This time she was ready to leave the judgments and assumptions behind and step into a future where her actions spoke louder than any words could ever do. She didn't need anyone's validation to know the worth of her work. She only needed to keep going and to never stop helping those who truly needed her. As Maria stepped out of the courthouse, the crisp air hit her skin, and she took a deep breath. The sounds of the outside world felt strangely peaceful compared to the tension she had just left behind. She paused for a moment as she stood at the top of the courthouse steps, looking out at the streets below, her mind still racing with thoughts of the judge and the case and everything that had transpired. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that the system wasn't working the way it should, but at the same time she knew she couldn't let herself get bogged down by it, not when so much was happening out there. People were waiting for her help, waiting for someone to make a difference. And that was where she needed to focus, not on the small injustices that happened in places like this, but on the bigger picture. Maria turned her attention to the horizon as she thought about the family she had been helping in the past few days, and the ones still waiting for age. She had seen firsthand the devastation that disasters left behind, and she knew how much work was still to be done. There were entire neighborhoods still in ruins and people who were struggling just to survive. She thought of the volunteers she had worked with and the many hours they had spent working together to bring supplies and aid to those who needed it. The work was exhausting, but it was also rewarding to know that they were making a difference, even in the face of such overwhelming adversity. Maria's phone buzzed in her pocket, and she pulled it out, glancing at the screen. It was a message from one of her team members, Asking if she was available for a meeting, the message was simple, but it reminded her that there was still so much to be done. She couldn't afford to waste any time dwelling on what had happened in the courthouse. She had a mission to complete, and the people who relied on her were counting on her to keep moving forward. She typed a quick reply confirming that she was available and that she'd be there soon, but before she could put the phone back in her pocket, she felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned around to see the courthouse clerk standing there, her expression earnest and full of curiosity. "I hope I'm not interrupting," the clerk said, "but I just wanted to let you know that I talked to a few people inside, and I told them what you do. I know it's not much, but they should be aware of your work, and maybe that can help with the future of your case." She looked at Maria with a hopeful smile. Maria raised an eyebrow, surprised by the clerk's sudden interest, but she appreciated it all the same. "Thank you," Maria said genuinely. "That means a lot to me. I don't know if it will change anything, but it's nice to know that there are people here who are at least willing to listen to my side." The clerk nodded and hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "I just wanted to say, Maria, I think what you do is incredible, and I'm really sorry that the judge didn't see that. He didn't even give you a chance to explain yourself, and I think that's wrong." The clerk's voice wavered slightly, but there was an undeniable sincerity in her words. Maria smiled faintly. It wasn't often she received that kind of acknowledgement, especially from someone who had only just met her, but it felt good to hear it, even if it didn't change anything about the situation at hand. "Thank you," Maria said again, feeling a sense of gratitude toward the clerk for her support. "I really do appreciate it, and I'm glad there's at least one person in this building who can see the bigger picture." The clerk smiled in return and nodded. "I'll keep you updated if anything else comes up with your case," she said, "but I have to get back to work now, so take care and good luck." Maria gave her a small wave as the clerk turned and walked away, but the moment lingered in her thoughts as she made her way toward her car. There was something powerful in knowing that there were people out there who understood, who could see beyond the surface, and Maria knew that it wasn't just about the courthouse or the judge or the fine. It was about the work she was doing and the impact it was having on the lives of those who needed it most. With that in mind, she felt a renewed sense of determination as she started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot. The world outside was waiting for her, and she couldn't afford to let anything hold her back. As Maria drove through the city streets, her thoughts shifted back to the families and communities she was helping. The image of the courthouse and the judge slowly faded into the background, replaced by the faces of the people she had met during her disaster relief work, the children who had lost their homes, and the elderly who had nowhere to go, the ones who had lost everything and still managed to show up every day with hope in their eyes and determination in their hearts. It was for them that Maria had dedicated her life, and it was for them that she couldn't afford to let anything stand in her way. She felt the familiar sense of urgency begin to settle back into her chest, the sense of responsibility that she had carried with her for so long. But now it felt different. She wasn't just heading back to the field to help people. She was heading back with a renewed sense of purpose and clarity. She had been shaken by what had happened at the courthouse, but she realized that it hadn't broken her. It hadn't taken away the reason she did this work, or the fire inside of her that had fueled her mission for years. The setback had been difficult, but it had also reminded her of something important, that her work was bigger than any individual moment or judgment. It was about the collective impact she could make in the lives of those who needed her most. As she navigated the winding streets, her phone buzzed again, and she quickly glanced at the screen. It was another message from her team, this time with an update on the relief efforts. One of the shelters had run out of supplies, and they were urgently requesting more food and blankets. It was a crisis she couldn't ignore. She quickly typed a response instructing them to mobilize a delivery of supplies, and then hit the gas pedal just a little harder. The urgency of the message pushed everything else to the back of her mind. There were lives at stake, and she needed to be there to ensure that they were taken care of. Her mind was already racing through the logistics of the delivery as she drove out of the city center, thinking about the best route to take and which volunteers she could call to help. When she reached the site, as much as Maria had learned to manage the chaos of her work, the truth was it never got any easier. The constant pressure of managing resources, coordinating teams, and providing relief never left her, and the weight of responsibility always seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. But it was a weight she had learned to carry, because she knew that what she was doing mattered. When she arrived at the shelter, she was greeted by the team of volunteers who were already busy unloading supplies and making sure the families had everything they needed. Maria jumped right into the work without missing a beat, checking in on the status of each area and ensuring that everything was running smoothly. She could see the exhaustion in the faces of the volunteers, but she also saw something else, a sense of purpose and pride in the work they were doing. Maria knew that they were just like her. They had been pulled into this work because they saw the need and couldn't walk away from it. No matter how tough things got, it was this shared sense of purpose that kept them going. And it was what made all of the setbacks and challenges worth it. She spent the next few hours coordinating efforts, helping to distribute the food and blankets to the families, and making sure that each person had what they needed to get through the night. But as she worked, she couldn't shake the thought that had been lingering in her mind ever since she left the courthouse. It was the thought that maybe, just maybe, there were more people out there who saw her work for what it was, who understood that what she was doing was more than just a job. It was a calling. It was something bigger than herself, and it mattered more than any fine or judgment could ever take away. As the day turned to night and the last of the families settled into the shelter, Maria stood outside for a moment, staring up at the dark sky. The stars were barely visible through the clouds, but she found herself staring up at them anyway. It was a small moment of reflection in the midst of the chaos, and for the first time that day, Maria allowed herself to feel a sense of peace. It wasn't much, but it was enough for now. She knew that the work wasn't done yet. There would always be more to do, but for the first time in a while, she felt like she had found her balance again. The world was full of uncertainty and injustice, but as long as she could help those who needed her, she knew that she was doing the right thing, and that was enough to keep her going. The following morning, Maria woke early, her mind still heavy with the events of the previous day. But she had learned that no matter how much the world tried to weigh her down, there was always work to be done. She had seen it too many times, the devastation, the pain, the heartbreak. But she had also seen the hope that could emerge from the darkest of times, the strength that people found when they had nothing left to lose. She dressed quickly and made her way to the shelter. The sun was just beginning to rise, and there was a crispness in the air that reminded her of the early days of her work, when everything felt like a battle to be won. But it also reminded her of the quiet moments of victory, when a family found a safe place to sleep, or when a community came together to rebuild something they thought they had lost forever. As she walked through the shelter, she noticed how much calmer it was this morning. Fewer people were gathered in the common areas, and the volunteers seemed more at ease. They had settled into a rhythm, and the families were beginning to find their footing again. Maria took a deep breath and went straight to the back to check on the team. They were already busy making preparations for the day ahead. There was more work to be done, more families to help and supplies to deliver, but there was something different in the air this morning, something more hopeful than she had felt in a long time. She spoke briefly with the team, giving out instructions and checking on any immediate needs, and then she stepped outside for a moment to gather her thoughts. The streets were quiet at this hour, and the sun was casting a soft golden light over the buildings. It was a peaceful sight, a contrast to the chaos of the past few weeks, and for the first time in a while, Maria allowed herself to pause and reflect on how far they had come from the first day of the storm to this moment of recovery. So much had been accomplished, and yet there was still so much more to do. But the thought didn't overwhelm her the way it once would have. It was simply the reality of the work she had chosen, and the reality of the people who depended on her. But Maria was okay with that. She had accepted it long ago, that this was her purpose, and that it was what she was meant to do. She wasn't going to let the small obstacles like the court case or the injustice she had faced stop her from continuing the mission she had set for herself. She knew that there would always be challenges and setbacks, but the work was bigger than any of that, and she was stronger than she had ever realized before. As she walked back into the shelter, she was greeted with smiles from the volunteers and families alike. There was a sense of gratitude in the air, and Maria could feel it wrapping around her like a warm embrace. It reminded her of the impact of her work, the way it reached beyond just the tasks and the hours of labor, and touched the hearts of those she served. It was a reminder that she wasn't invisible, she wasn't unimportant. Her work had meaning, And it mattered, and in that moment it was as if everything had come full circle. It was no longer about the courthouse, or the judgment, or the fine. It was about the real difference she was making in the world, and the lives she was helping to rebuild from the ground up. Maria moved through the shelter with a renewed sense of purpose. There was still much to be done, and she would be there for every moment of it. No matter what the world tried to throw her way, she had learned that when she did the work for the right reasons, when she stayed true to the purpose that drove her, nothing could take that away. Nothing could diminish the impact she was making in the lives of those who needed her most. As the day went on, Maria found herself smiling more often. The weight of the previous days began to feel lighter, and the moments of connection with those she served felt deeper than ever before. She could hear the laughter of children in the distance, and the sounds of people working together to rebuild their lives. And she knew that in the end, this was the true victory. This was the legacy of the work she had dedicated her life to. The impact was lasting, and no judgment or fine could ever take that away. It was hers to carry, and it was enough to keep her moving forward, always forward, one family at a time, one community at a time, until the work was done.